your question, or you're free to pop them in the chat as well, in which case I'll read it out. So I think that's everything, and I will hand over to James.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you to both Rachel, Phoebe, and everyone organising the seminar series for the wonderful opportunity to come and present my research to you all. As Rachel mentioned, I am an early career research fellow at Corpus Christi College within the University of Cambridge. And I'm really excited for the chance to sort of talk about my research and put it in a broader scale narrative. And that narrative that I will try and weave through the different things that I've been doing over the last few years will focus on the scales of technological variability, largely in the lower Paleolithic, and with the broad aim of going from seasonal influences up to potentially above species level influences. Okay. In terms of the structure for the talk, I'm going to start with some introduction on the theoretical background and touch on some of the work I've been doing with modern analogues into investigating the influences on behavioural adaptation. We're then going to move into the archaeological record and try and move broadly through the different scales of analysis that I will raise in a second, moving from very small snapshots in time up to much bigger processes. And finally, I will try and bring everything together by talking about technological complexity and how it might relate to macroevolution in the hominin lineage. And I will try and round off with some quite broad conclusions. So, to jump into the introduction, when we talk about the influences on hominin behavior, we can explore the relationship of specific variables at a number of different temporal scales. These might be of really high resolution, focusing on sub-seasonal or even daily sources of evidence, but they can also be of incredibly low resolution, making comparisons, for example, at the geological level of the entire hominin lineage. Of course, high-resolution data points do exist in the archaeological record of the deep time archaeological record, such as the few hours of activity represented by the horse butchery site at Boxgrove, GTP 17. But broadly speaking, the frequency of such high-resolution observations are amongst the most infrequent of all possible lines of evidence. And we therefore face this broad trade-off between how often we can make observations at specific temporal scales and how much we can actually learn from each of those individual observations. This little blue box shows what we might be able to observe, or what scales we might be able to observe in modern analogues. And this is where I'm going to start by introducing some of the theoretical background. And this is not least because the drivers of technological variability specifically have been extensively explored in both pannins as a marker of what the capacity at the base of the hominin lineage might have looked like, but especially in modern human groups. And I'm going to explore these modern analogues and then the archaeological record squarely through the lens of behavioural ecological models. Such models envision foragers or indeed populations as rational agents, acting to maximise fitness in their given environment. And they explicitly assume that foragers are completely aware of the distribution of resources within their environment. Assuming for the moment that this actually is the case, there are two main schools of thought around what are the most important behavioural ecological drivers of technological variability. The first of these is around the role of ecological risk, and the second of these is around the role of demography, and specifically population size and internal structure. I'm not going to comment too much on the specifics of this debate, but I will point out that the ecological risk hypothesis has frequently been supported by ethnographic observations, and the example on the left of the slide from this Reed and Anderson study looks at the relationship between a specific variable of technological change with the length of the growing season and the number of moves within a year. And whereas the importance of demography has largely come out of modelling and experimental evidence, and this is an example on the right of the slide from Derricks and Mazzoudi, which argues that intermediate levels of population connectivity are the most conducive to cumulative cultural evolution. And instead of talking about these two variables in enormous detail, I will argue that one variable that's been largely overlooked is that of landscape knowledge, or rather, the extent to which a population is aware of the distribution and predictability of individual resources within their unique range. Going back to the assumptions I mentioned on the previous slide, it is self-evident that a foraging group will not always be aware of the distribution of all resources within their range, and therefore integrating a variable such as landscape knowledge can help to explain the cost benefits around specific decision-making processes and the ultimate outcomes in behavioural adaptation. And on the slide, we're presenting two sets of data which show a consistent relationship between the number of foraging tools in modern human populations and the average complexity of both of those tools. And this highlights that there might be transferable knowledge between individual tools or tool components that makes the cost of additional investment in more complicated tools elsewhere in the toolkit less costly. I mean, and the results on the left come from a reanalysis of a classic data set that I've been involved in from Oswalt in the mid-70s. And on the right, we have this very recent paper from Hamilton and colleagues, in which they further specified that the relationship between this average tool part complexity with the increasing toolkit richness is sublinear. And they actually argue that while there might be reduced costs associated with investing when you already have more tools in the toolkit, that those returns are slightly diminishing in that you don't always get the same level of return as you invest more and more in more complex technologies. I am selfishly very happy that we submitted our paper on the left before this one on the right came out, because otherwise I'm not entirely certain it would have been considered novel enough to publish. Now, if there's one thing that you should know about me and my research, it's that I love to publish a flowchart. And in this case, I'm introducing flowcharts as a way of helping to explore the nature of what is contained within this broad category of landscape knowledge. And this is a question that my colleague Gonzalo Linares Matas and I have been studying for quite some time. And here we turn specifically to chimpanzee observations as a more simple and perhaps a better way of getting at the specific mechanisms that might be involved in landscape knowledge as a concept. In this paper, we argued that the frequency with which higher quality resources, so those which have higher caloric returns, were present within an individual chimpanzee population's diet could be associated with the extent of accumulated information about first the spatial and then the temporal distribution of those resources, and finally, information on how to exploit specific resources at times of seasonal scarcity that might allow those resources to unusually be consumed all year round. And so, for example, in most chimpanzee populations, termite fishing and ant dipping are highly seasonally constrained, but there are some populations, such as the Gualugo chimpanzees, that seem to be able to carry out these behaviors through tool-assisted means throughout the year. And on this point, we suggested that the extent of knowledge accumulation about individual high-quality resources was also broadly associated with both the likelihood and complexity of tool use in chimpanzees, as the increasing predictability of return facilitated more confident investment in behavioral adaptation and, again, more certain returns. And I want to raise how all of this fits into another concept, that of cultural fitness landscapes. And this is work I've been very lucky to be involved in, but led by the very cool stuff being done by Lucy Timbrell. And in such models, we might consider climate as constraining the possible range of behavioral strategies for any given population, where resource density and diversity will determine the number of possible successful behavioral strategies. Though, of course, these will not always have the same return potential, and that will change the relative height of these peaks. In this context, ecological risk can be thought of occurring where there is only a limited diversity and/or density of resources, and therefore a limited number of behavioural strategies available. And this creates a situation where failure of one behavioural strategy might have quite devastating consequences for the group, and therefore investment is really important to make sure that such failure does not occur. At the same time, adaptation will also be constrained by the intra and inter-annual predictability of the environment, as the fitness landscape is constantly reshaped at different temporal scales. And we've argued that the predictability of such shifts will determine how easy or difficult it is to accumulate landscape knowledge that might facilitate investment in the toolkit through the predictability of returns. And it's also in this context that population size or specific demographic structures might facilitate the acquisition and maintenance of that knowledge. And to try and bring this all together, we would suggest that the most investment in the toolkit would be seen in environments that are risky but stable and have demographic conditions that allow the accumulation of knowledge. Now, this does show us how landscape knowledge might help us understand known drivers of behavior in modern contexts where the capacity for adaptation is held constant. But what happens in the archaeological record when we are comparing between species with potentially variable capacities for knowledge accumulation, especially through time? And this is where I would raise the possibility of landscape knowledge capacity as having the potential to serve as an evolutionarily useful scale, where the amount of knowledge it is possible to accumulate is not constant through time. I will note that not that all of these scales are completely arbitrary and the trend is intentionally non-linear. The hominin scales are also not broken down according to both population-specific observations and a wider species-level capacity, because we cannot, of course, exactly because we cannot assume that the capacities were equal whenever multiple species were present at once, especially where we have difficulty assigning specific behavioural outcomes to the fossils that we know existed around the same time. Of course, observations for any given hominin time point may underestimate the maximum possible landscape knowledge capacity at those time points, and this might be represented by time point 2 at the bottom. But it also does allow us to explore broad macroevolutionary trends if we can plot data through time and look at the broad trajectory of changes. And also, this has the advantage of bypassing more complicated reconstructions of cognition, which come attached with their own theoretical concepts. And so if we try and bring this all together, here is a hypothetical set of relationships between known variables of especially ecological risk and demography and technological investment, where we leave landscape knowledge out. And so again, this has to assume that the foraging group are completely aware of the distribution of resources within their environment, and it does not comment on the mechanisms relating demography specifically to technological investment. Of course, all models are wrong, but we benefit from those that are as simple as they need to be useful. And this model is both very simple and helps us to understand technology in specific observable contexts, but it's also quite limiting if we wish to go beyond this, especially when we want to look at the archaeological record. And so here is an updated set of relationships in which landscape knowledge is included. And it emphasizes that, again, foraging groups do not need to know all of the resources within their environment. And it clarifies the relationship between demography and technology, even for modern populations where the capacity for landscape knowledge is relatively fixed. I would therefore argue that landscape knowledge is a useful inclusion in behavioural ecological models because, one, the models can still be relatively simple overall and yet overcome one of the biggest flaws in behavioural ecological modelling, namely about knowing the distribution of resources. Two, that it helps to explain relationships between the established variables and especially demography. And three, that it might allow our models to transgress beyond static time points and potentially cover all of the scales of analysis that we introduced at the beginning. And so For the rest of my talk, I'm going to try and dive into the archaeological record and try and illustrate how landscape knowledge in particular can be quite useful for looking at these broader scale models. So let's jump into some snapshots early on and then try and relate these to broader processes. And I want to start by thinking about the relationship between seasonality and technological investment specifically. And this is something that Gonzalo and I came up with initially during many long hours of discussion about the archaeological record over the phone during successive pandemic lockdowns. And at the root of the idea was the wealth of observations that we already have of how human behavior is influenced by seasonality in hunter-gatherer groups. And the example on the left of the slide relates to Juruanzi camp movement, and specifically, this is a wet season camp in Mongongo groves, alongside a clear likelihood that the proximate drivers of technological change that we theorize about in the archaeological record would exert different pressures in both wet and dry seasons, specifically in Eastern Africa. And in particular, ethnographic observations from tropical and subtropical latitudes repeatedly underline the greater consumption of animal tissue in the dry season, while observations of carnivore and indeed herbivore behavior clearly highlight that competition risk is far greater during the dry season. I don't think it's controversial to suggest that these variables might have impacted the ultimate outcome of the toolkit, but we essentially set out to explore whether it was possible to test such an influence of seasonality in what we can actually observe in the early archaeological record. And in particular, we trawled through a number of observations of seasonal changes to animal behavior in Eastern Africa to see if there were any useful markers that we might be able to observe in faunal assemblages. So to give just a few examples, John Speth has emphasized the massive increase in testudine, so specifically tortoise, activity during wet seasons, and a number of authors have also highlighted the early wet season bovid birthing peak, the concentration of a diversity of animal sources, animals around water sources during the dry season, and especially the late dry season, as well as the possible differences in animal tooth microwear according to the season of the animal's death, though this is not perfect. And we tried to come up with some markers that we could look for and apply to the archaeological record, and started with the Oldowan sites of Kangera South and FLK Zinj as initial case studies. And the reason that this fantastic drawing of waterbuck is on the slide, on the left of the slide from Gonzalo's sister Sophia, is because waterbuck are by far the most represented species in the Zinj level of FLK. There is also clear primary access to the animals, who are largely lone late prime males or prime females, some of whom may have been pregnant given the presence of fetal waterbuck at the site in addition to the adult remains. And this might give us an indication of animals being present at the site later on in the dry season before the wet season birthing peak. And so we tried to bring all of these observations together into a final framework that we might be able to use to test seasonality in the archaeological record, focusing on a number of both paleoecological and predicted taphonomic signatures from the different lines of evidence that we have available. And in this paper, in the Journal of Paleolithic Archaeology, we tried to apply it, first of all, to sites across the Oldowan as a sort of proof of concept. And while we collated, published faunal data from 13 different Oldowan sites, we also collated published technological information, and we explored the structure of the technological information through hierarchical clustering. I won't go into more detail about the nature of the technological detail we collected, but I'm happy to ask questions on it on the end. I will just quickly note that of the two dendrograms that are present on the slide, on the left, we have an example with retouch included in the analysis, which was not present for all of the sites that had published data. And therefore had to be imputed for 3 sites. And on the right, we therefore we also ran the analysis when excluding retouched data. Of course, these data come with massive caveats and the desperate need for more data and more robust frameworks. But when we overlaid our reconstructions of the possible seasons of deposition, we were quite shocked to see a relatively clear separation of the 2 clusters. These clusters do not map on to differences in chronology. There is both early and late sites in both. It does not map onto landscape, and Oldowan in particular has sites across both dendrograms. And it also doesn't really map on to material use, in particular the division between quartzite and lava-based dominance. And to us, this is indicating possible evidence that the nature of investment in the toolkit was changing between wet and dry seasons in Eastern Africa. And this might reflect hominin adaptation on really short temporal scales. We then tried to do the same thing for the early Acheulean record from before 1.2 million years ago. And this presents the broadest level summary of the technological data we have using the same methods. Each individual colored circle next to a site represents a landscape. And you can see that there clearly is clustering of landscape in this dendrogram, which might indicate some sort of specialized local adaptations, though it also comes attached with the caveat that sites published from the same landscape often have the same missing variables and therefore are sometimes have to be imputed. And the imputing of multiple variables from the same landscape will tend to cause those sites to cluster together. When we explored the faunal records of these sites, the data are actually much worse than we have available for many sites in the Oldowan. But we can try and zoom in on the 3 sites with the clearest evidence of animal exploitation, which, as I said previously, is almost certainly going to be biased towards drier parts of the year. And these sites, so particularly the ST complex at Peninge, SHK main and BK L4B, both Oldowan, are assemblages which have few to no bifaces present in the assemblage. And while we struggled to find wet season sites to which we could compare these data, it did lead us to the hypothesis that bifaces were more likely to be used during the wet season, when probably consuming animal resources less and focusing to a greater extent on other plant resources which might have been present within the landscape. The suggestion that bifaces were used more often during the wet season is somewhat counterintuitive with prevailing hypotheses for the innovation of bifaces, in particular that they were innovated for use directly in heavy-duty butchery activity, again, presumably during the dry season, or that they were more general heavy-duty tools that might have provided a critical adaptive strategy throughout the year, so also tasks such as woodworking in addition to butchery. Now, an alternative but understudied hypothesis holds that instead, bifaces might simply be allometric extensions of Oldowan cores, which are a more efficient source of flakes. This might provide some more clear mechanism for why we might be talking about the wet season in terms of the origins of bifaces, but we needed to test this and we need more data on how, we need a greater theoretical understanding of how those 2 things might be related. And so we sought to test the bifaces as cause hypothesis through replication experiments focused on producing both Oldowan and early Acheulean products. This put particular emphasis on the potential advantages of reducing large flake blanks, given that the secondary flaking of these large flakes is one of the key features of the early Acheulean, but which is really rare in the Oldowan. All of the napping was carried out by a single expert flint napper, the amazing John Lord, who you can see on the slide, who produced both bifaces and more traditional Oldowan type core forms on both cobble and large flake blanks under a series of constraints which he found enormously frustrating. So those constraints were that all conditions made use of a hard hammer only, that he could not deploy platform preparation beyond the removal of previous flakes, that cores were limited, and that cores were limited to 20 flakes per artifact. But what was varied was the nature and goals of the napping strategy. So the unidirectional condition, for example, utilized only a single platform and face of the core, whereas the others could release flakes from both faces around the edge of the core while maintaining the dominance of one napping strategy, which was archaeologically informed. The Handaxe conditions, so Handaxe rounded and Handaxe pointed, were the only ones to dictate a target form to the napper and are based on the shape trajectory seen in the early Acheulean Acheulean. I won't go into more detail about them, but if anyone have any questions about the difference between the two and why we did it, I'd be happy to answer them at the end. And then flakes were all analysed according to the established methods of flake utility, which uses metric data to assess the relative efficiency of cutting edge production and how the optimization of this trait might be under the control of the napper. The key finding of this experiment was that reduction of large flake blanks seemed to produce a larger amount of usable cutting edge relative to the volume of core at the time of striking. And this is really interesting because it's potentially the first clear evidence that the shifts towards flaking large flakes in the early Acheulean might be related to an optimization process of core reduction rather than an attempt to directly produce a large cutting tool right from the beginning of the napping process. But a classic part of behavioral ecological models is still exploring the trade-offs related to why a particular behavior might be useful. And despite producing more total cutting edge relative to the size of the core, in the case of flaking large flakes, the trade-offs seem to be related to a reduced amount of cutting edge on each individual flake and a relatively larger size of the platforms compared to the dorsal surface. Even then, if we look at Handaxe manufacture, it seems to be the most efficient way of minimizing these trade-offs on large flake blanks when compared to the two Oldowan reduction strategies. And on the slide, what we can see are the data on the relative size of the platform compared to the dorsal area of the flake. And we can see that while flake blanks produce larger platforms across the board, the two Handaxe conditions reduce the size of the platform and put it more towards the range of cobble blank variation. Across a number of Gonzalo and I's studies on seasonality in the Oldowan and the early Acheulean, we have argued that the elaboration of technological investment through time must be related to long-term accumulation of landscape knowledge. This might be related to an initial dry season origin of lithic technology, and we've argued that there's more evidence of dry season sites earlier on in the Oldowan range, but which is followed by long-term accumulation of information about the distribution of resources, perhaps particularly in the wet season, and how cutting edge might be usefully deployed to exploit those wet season resources. And in our very first paper, where we discussed this idea in 2020, we actually argued that the increasing predictability of resources in time and space through landscape knowledge might actually be traced in specific early Acheulean reduction strategies, which might have roots in the older one of the same regions before the transition. Bringing all of this together, we might envision a hypothesis in which, again, bifaces emerge in the context of long-term landscape habituation, associated with changing patterns of structured landscape use that we know to have happened by the time of the early Acheulean. We don't have evidence of increased transport distances, but we do have evidence of fragmentation of the reduction strategy across the landscape and differential transport of things like bifaces in different stages of reduction. Unsurprisingly, I would suggest that this can only have been built on long-term accumulation of knowledge regarding both how best to carry out the napping process, as well as the distribution of resource patches in time and space. And in this context, and with the more predictable need to transport flake tools between resource patches, large flakes as blanks are particularly useful because they're lighter for a given amount of required cutting edge, and probably therefore will minimize the energetic investment required to produce that cutting edge. And of course, we might hypothesize that such structured patterns of landscape use might have varied seasonally, as the relative availability of different foodstuffs change throughout the year. And particularly in ethnographic observations of drier seasons, you see clustering of groups around water sources, greater emphasis on using those more sedentary bases to exploit animal tissue, but greater mobility between different resource patches during the wet season, which is also reflected in camp movement. In this scenario, we may tentatively associate bifaces, again, with wet season patterns of behavior, where they are carried about the landscape during wet season foraging patterns, but we need much more data to test this association. Now, one of the questions that I've sidestepped so far is how these proposed relationships between long-term landscape knowledge accumulation and seasonality might actually relate to macro-scale reconstructions of climate change, especially from marine, lacustrine, and terrestrial coring data. And these data have been really important in generating hypotheses for the hominin lineage, particularly around variability selection and the notion that hominins are adapted to experiencing a wide range of ecological conditions. We have tried to get into this question by putting emphasis on the distribution of resources as the most proximate driver of behavioural adaptation, but in the context of landscape and regional level responses to global scale orbital forcing. We also reviewed data on how climatic variability at this macro scale might have impacted the actual conditions experienced by hominins within their lifetimes, especially in terms of seasonality and year-to-year unpredictability, arguing that variance in resource distributions between seasons and indeed years would have been greatest during the intermittent arid periods that we see in Eastern Africa in particular, across the Pleistocene. We also tried to integrate how some key variables from the cultural fitness landscapes we introduced earlier might have shifted throughout these both arid and more humid periods, and how these might have been reflected in the behavioural outcomes of hominins through the entirety of the early and middle Stone Age. We perhaps bit off more than we could chew, placing particular emphasis on how these arid periods with potentially high interannual predictability would have constrained the ability of groups to accumulate landscape knowledge. We argued that these arid periods would have constrained further investment in lithic technology and would have instead emphasized widespread regional adoption of more generalized cultural variants that allow the navigation of where each tool allows the navigation of a diversity of resources and foraging and processing tasks, but with reduced overall returns in each of those tasks. We alternatively suggested that the wetter periods would emphasize greater investment in specialized local toolkits in which you get a greater number of individual variants with high specificity to specific foraging and processing tasks, and with much greater return for each of those tasks. It might also be that innovations in these wetter periods form the basis of variants that can come to act as more widespread generalist adaptations upon subsequent returns to aridity. And one of the examples we gave in this respect was the widespread experimentation with prepared core technologies in wetter periods of the late Acheulean, which of course become much more widespread with an arid period at the beginning of the Middle Stone Age. And to very briefly again stay with the Middle Stone Age, one thing that we didn't talk about in that QSA paper was the important role of ecological risk in shaping the nature of behavioural responses in different regions of the continent, even when both regions were faced with a single set of orbitally forced pressures. I was really fortunate again to be part of this fantastic work led by Lucy, looking at how climatic pressures vary between Eastern and Northern Africa. And through climatic modeling, we were able to show that, amongst other things, Northern Africa consistently showed higher site-level temperature seasonality during MSA occupations than did Eastern Africa. And yet, there was no evidence of a difference in longer-term climatic predictability between the North and the East. And in the context of past discussions of higher specificity in cultural variance in the Northern African MSA and the model that I've been presenting already, I would argue that the greater seasonality in Northern Africa was probably reducing the range of potential responses in the cultural fitness landscape, but also increasing the ecological risk of those individual responses failing. And at the same time, the continued environmental predictability would have equally facilitated the accumulation of the landscape knowledge required to be able to climb these more isolated peaks. And this sort of predictably risky set of environmental conditions is probably what maximizes relative technological investment. One example that we did draw attention to in the QSA paper was how we might be able to see a change in the possibilities associated with biface manufacture across the mid-Pleistocene transition from 1.2 million years ago. And for example, we see increases in the maximum thinness of artifacts potentially associated with soft hammer use. We see increases in the maximum symmetry of artifacts. And I'm also involved in some work that explores whether there might actually be reducing variance of Handaxe shape in the late early Pleistocene as well. And all of this evidence coincides with the period that we have increasing evidence that bifaces are starting to become used directly as cutting tools, which with much greater frequency than we see in the early Acheulean. And so possibly we're seeing a shift in the actual function of these tools that allow them to take on a much more generalist character. But in contrast to this homogenization in Eastern Africa in the late early Pleistocene, both Eastern and Northern Africa may see quite dramatic intra-regional specialization or differentiation in shape before 300,000 years ago. And this might support the presence of one such period of regionalization, hyper-regionalization and specialization during some wetter periods in the later Acheulean before the onset of the MSA. No such trend can yet be seen in the Southern African record in terms of the Handaxes that I've sampled. But South Africa does show homogeneity from the late early Pleistocene at Lansfontein until around 400,000 years ago with the Manzi Springs. But it also sees a late shift towards Handaxe shapes, which are seemingly more similar to Eastern African forms. So we might be seeing a combination of sort of regional demographic responses as well as broader scale dispersal. But going back to the generalist character of bifaces potentially in the late early and middle Pleistocene, this might have quite important implications for the nature of our separation from the so-called Neandersovan lineage and the latter's subsequent dispersal. In particular, generalist variants lend themselves very nicely to long-distance dispersal, exactly because they can be used across a diversity of tasks and therefore a diversity of ecological and climatic context, regardless of the specific resources or specific animals being exploited. To give a particularly extreme example, I have been co-directing excavations at Fordwich Pit over the last few years at Old Park just outside Canterbury, and we recently published evidence that hominins might have been occupying Britain during a full glacial period through soft hammer flaking in MIS 12. And we don't yet have new Handaxes, but there is a lot of taphonomic data that suggests that we might be able to associate these soft hammer flakes with high investment in a small proportion of the old quarry Handaxes that were recovered in the early 1900s. This dispersal during a glacial period might have been during a slightly warmer interstadial, but it certainly underlines interesting patterns about the nature of what is possible in terms of dispersal with a very generalist variant or the generalist use of bifaces in the Middle Pleistocene. And also, really interestingly, we might be able to track dispersal across the Old World across the Middle Pleistocene through planform Handaxe shape, as we seem to see regional differentiation in target forms. African Handaxes in particular seem to be much more pointed and elongated than those from the Levant and Europe, particularly later on in time, whereas those outside of Africa, and especially from the Levant, tend to be much more rounded and less elongated. Some traits of Handaxes, such as refinement and symmetry, however, do not seem to vary by region in the Middle Pleistocene, which instead may correlate with the amount of time spent in the landscape. And we tried to bring this all together by arguing that planform Handaxe shape, while being subject to relatively local raw material, blank, and resharpening pressures, is uniquely subject to much broader scale regional influences on the manufacture norms, whereas traits such as symmetry and refinement might be more impacted by questions of ecology, site function, and crucially, landscape knowledge. And this highlights how different scales of analysis might even be seen within specific artifact types, and why the questions we ask of the archaeological record are so important to the information we get from it. To very briefly round off the talk, you will have noticed that I've completely jumped over ways of standardizing measured behavioral responses and instead focused on a diversity of bottom-up approaches to technological investment. And this does allow a wide range of evidence to be explored, but it also means we might sometimes be comparing apples to oranges in terms of behavioral adaptation. Similarly, I've not yet said anything about the changing capacity to accumulate landscape knowledge or innovate through time, and I'm going to try and introduce both of these questions through the lens of technological complexity. Of course, I am not claiming to be the first person to ever talk about complexity in both archaeological data and also in modern analogues, but I want to highlight that we often mean quite different things by it. And in particular, I'm going to try and focus on approaches which measure either the number of parts, so either behavioral or physical components, present in a technology, as well as the relationship between those parts. And in a paper that will hopefully come out soon, we review a number of these different approaches in terms of their ease of application, their applicability to ethnographic, primatological, and archaeological data, their outcome variance and how this compares to specific correlates you might want to investigate, and whether these approaches might be plausibly applied across different types of material, whether they could equally be applied to wooden spears as lithic material throughout time. And we have a number of great methods that already exist. So on the right, we have some work from Miriam Heidel looking at cognograms, which essentially break the production sequence into a series of goals and sub-goals, which allow us to produce a usable metric of complexity. But it's also really hard to get into if you don't have a background in cognitive archaeology. And this is where we thought there might be scope for a new way of looking at the problem of complexity. And so we're presenting the tool systems approach as an attempt to map the wider interaction of objects in a tool's manufacture sequence that can incorporate data from both modern observations and the archaeological record. The approach splits any given tool production behavior into 6 discrete types of action, namely material selection, tool shaping, the interaction of multiple materials, the release of an object whose morphology is obscured by the external appearance of the raw material, also known as opacity, changes to the characteristics of a material in preparation for subsequent actions, and finally, integration of more than one discrete element into the tool form, or modularity. The tool production sequence is then scored according to 2 separate variables. The first of these is how many of the 6 actions are included, known as the total discrete actions, as well as how many steps are involved in the overall tool system, known as the tool system's total. We're very open about the method being modelled on the combinatorial and compositional components of language, and we may even tentatively associate traits like the total discrete actions with working memory capacity, but we also don't need to do this. And I think stepping aside from this and focusing generally on landscape knowledge is actually a quite useful way to look at the question of macroevolution. The example of the tool system on the slide decomposes the manufacture of complex wooden poisoned arrows by Hadza hunter-gatherers into these constituent behaviors representing all 6 behavioral categories and a total of 18 discrete steps. Now, when we apply this concept to selected technologies from the Lamechwian and the Oldowan, we see that individual early technologies are quite modest in the number of steps and actions involved, with direct percussion in the Oldowan perhaps showing an additional step in the tool system and maybe one more discrete action when utilizing multiple related platforms only. But this is, of course, something we see from the very beginning of the Oldowan. Late Oldowan innovations of core on flake manufacture add another 2 steps compared to direct hammer percussion with related platforms, but then only 1 or 2 steps are added in early Acheulean biface manufacture, depending on the site you take as your reference. It doesn't, however, involve additional actions in the sequence across the Oldowan Acheulean transition. And this implies a really slow rate of change that corresponds quite well to the gradual optimization of the flake producing process that we talked about earlier. It is only with some late Handaxes and early Levallois technology at the end of the Lower Paleolithic that we start to see a 5th action included in the reduction sequence, but this doesn't necessarily change the total complexity of the overall system. And again, continuing a very slow pace of change throughout the Low Paleolithic. It is only when different modules start to contribute to the final tool form that we see an explosion in the inferred complexity of archaeological objects, and the example on the slide is the hafting of early retouched blades from Cathu Pan into inferred projectile points, with each of the steps in dotted lines the minimum possible complexity for the non-visible parts of the sequence. And this produces a tool system's total of 19 steps, more than double the previously most complex inferred sequence at this point in time, and comparing very similarly to the Hadza arrows that we brought up previously. When we plot the tool system's total and total discrete actions for specific novel sequences according to their first appearance dates, in the tool system's total in particular, we quite clearly see that there is an inflection point around 500,000 years ago, which is very similar to that suggested by Page and Perot for the onset of cumulative cultural evolution through their procedural unit approach to stone tool complexity. Now, within the landscape knowledge framework, we need not interpret this inflection point so specifically in terms of mechanism, but I do think it helps us to track possible changes to landscape knowledge capacity through time. And indeed, we might hypothesize that hominins in Africa are largely overcoming the constraints of landscape knowledge capacity before the onset of the MSA, but we do need a much better data set of complexity through time and space to test this properly. To finish off with some quick conclusions, there's a lot more to do, but landscape knowledge, I think, can be a useful tool for exploring technological variability in both present and past populations. We also see evidence of hominin climatic adaptation all the way from seasonal up to potentially orbital scales of change. Handaxe variation specifically can provide information on different scales of behavior, from local or regional scale adaptation, perhaps up to demographic variables that we might be able to feed back into our models of technological change. And finally, we still have, again, much more to do, but technological complexity may map macroevolutionary trends in terms of landscape knowledge capacity without getting into the specific mechanisms of cognitive change. And with that, thank you very much. Thank you all very much for listening. I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Thank you, James, for a really, really great talk. You covered a lot of different threads, so I'm sure that we'll have lots of questions coming up. I'll just give people a minute to write stuff in the chat, or people are welcome to put their hand up if they would like.
I'll
We've
take
got a couple of people using the applaud emoji, so
Thank you very much, everyone. I was going to say I'll take that as I've explained everything so well.
absolutely. John, do you have a question? John, did you have a question? Yeah, there you go.
Hi. Sorry, we're competing to ask questions, I think. Hi, James. That was great. Thanks. There's so much there. I hardly know what to sort of comment on or question. I think for those of us who have working on a particular project, then you kind of ask, okay, how do we align some of this with our particular project and what's going on? The bit that we would probably inject is to do with elevation, really. And then we've got the problem that that's fairly unusual. So I think they are at high levels, or we're at high levels. But, you know, we have an old river running by that drops 2 kilometers in 70 kilometers. And it's probably, it's probably been there all the time. So we would have to take into account that perennial river being quite close by. But I've no idea how it would affect the artifacts at this moment. And I guess that a lot of our problem with the Acheulean is what Glyn Isaac used to refer to as its variable sameness. And anyway, I think you're finding lots of interesting ways into it. So I haven't really got a question unless you've got anything to say about the elevation.
I can try my best to jump in. Thank you very much for all of that. You touched on a number of really important threads. If I jump back to one of my previous slides, I'll point out that I copped out of the question of topography and put it as an arrow on this specific flowchart, but have never looked at it in any more detail. Presumably, topography is a really, really important variable for how landscapes are responding to regional and global scale climatic pressures. How we integrate that into our models will obviously require us to have a much better and broader data set of technological variability, good elevation data, which theoretically shouldn't be as hard to get. And we could perhaps look at that on a macro scale. I think in terms of how that sort of interacts with things like seasonality, I guess if it's possible to use the faunal assemblage to try and reconstruct seasons, whether those are the same for one or all of the sites at Colombo would be very interesting. And to see how that influences the nature of the toolkit and how it compares to other early Acheulean sites which are around in less high topographies would be a really interesting question to explore. But yes, at this moment in time, I don't have better data to give you a better answer.
Okay. I'm not sure we do either. Anyway, enjoyed it very much. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, John. I'm not seeing any other questions yet or any in the chat. Oh, Marta, do you have a question?
It's a bit of a, it's unfair. I mean, we talk every day, but question. I mean, I think it was fantastic to see it all brought together. It was a lot of information to process. I guess I'm going to pick just a little bit at the end and think about, yes, the landscapes of knowledge and how that affected, and it is a component in the package. And then you say, in a way, ignoring the cognitive ability. right? So in a way, part of what we do in the record is recognize that there are many factors contributing to the patterns that we see. And can we isolate and control by some of the patterns? So how will you go about exploring or controlling for that cognitive difference?
I mean, it's a great question, and one that I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about at this moment in time. So my idea with the sort of macroevolutionary, how does technological complexity through time change through time, is that if we get a sort of maximum complexity for any given time point, then we can sort of track something which is cognitively adjacent without going into cognitive mechanisms. Now, that is partially a cop-out. So landscape knowledge, I'm trying to keep behavioral ecological models as simple as necessary while still integrating variables that we know will have changed quite importantly and quite dramatically through time. So this is essentially an attempt to say the ability to accumulate this knowledge, we can track how it might be changing, but we're not commenting on why. And then we have to take a step back and try and bring in other cognitive concepts. And these are conversations I'm having with people that work on neural and language evolution through the hominin lineage. I think we can trace a lot of cognitive changes really into the hominin lineage. And it would be interesting to see at what point people who work very explicitly on the neural and other mechanisms of cognition, when they see constraints being overcome and how this relates to such broad scale changes in things like complexity.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge there is that in a way that there are these parallel lines of research on the neuroscience side, on the neuroscience of linguistics, but they don't translate easily with what we see, which at the end are the stones on the ground and the pattern and the seasonality of the site and what animals and etc. So it's trying to make that translation.
Absolutely. And I will say, watch this space. There are some things coming down the pipeline.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much, Martha.
Thank you so much for that. It's great for me when the conversation just takes off by itself. It's awesome. Thanks, everyone. I think that brings us up nicely to the hour. So unless anyone has any last minute questions that they want to throw in, I think we'll call it there. I can't see anything in the chat, so I'd just like to say thank you again, everyone, for your participation and for attending today. And thank you very much, Dr. Clark, for a really, really great talk.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for the invite again.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.